Amy Schneider, Jeopardy winner, $1.3 million she has won so far, 39-game winning streak, transgender woman.
Oh.
Would you go on Jeopardy?
I don't think I would do well on Jeopardy, not gonna lie.
You know, it's interesting. Jeopardy's have been in such controversy lately because they keep choosing potential hosts, including one of their producers who have some sexual misconduct allegations and some really problematic Twitter histories.
We really should not be putting these people on any sort of platform except for the platform of prison.
So, I mean, everybody has some problematic intentions, but who doesn't seem to is Amy Schneider, winner of Jeopardy and winner of our hearts as a transgender person who is absolutely owning it in this extremely knowledgeable and cerebral space.
That is really, really fucking cool. I have to say, like, I've known quite a few trans people who are extremely smart, and it is awesome to see them on a platform that allows them to show off a little bit, because I think that trans women and trans men, just trans people in general, don't really have a space to, like, show off.
You know, it's interesting. I don't want to make correlation without causation, but I know so many trans people that are absolutely brilliant. And I think that maybe there's some correlation between self-discovery and self-identity and being able to articulate who you are and how smart you are as a person. I don't know how you feel about that.
I don't disagree with that. I think more so it's the confidence. Once you figure out who you are, it's really much easier to be confident in who you are. And so, you know, like, I am a trans person, and I am proud of that fact, and I will tell whoever is willing to listen to that.
You're also very smart.
Well, thank you. Yeah, you know, like, it's really interesting to see that other trans people also are confident and smart and being able to express that. Hi, I'm Anna, a transgender person.
And I'm Cam, your dad.
And this is The Transgender, a podcast chronicling my transition.
And a cisgender man learning to support it.
So, speaking of showing off and being a bomb-ass bitch, Lia Thomas is the hotbed of news media recently. She is a trans swimmer who has been making waves, thank you, in the NCAA swimming categories. So she's been breaking records and everything, and a lot of people have had problematic takes about this. For example, Michael Phelps himself has correlated her, this trans woman, breaking records to doping, and has said that sports need to get back onto an even playing field.
Well, he said that he has never competed on an even playing field before. And I want to pause and say, this man is built like some kind of mer person with webbed fingers. Michael Phelps is built like a human swimming machine. So to think that he's never competed in a fair field before
is solely because of him, I imagine.
I mean, he's accusing every competition that he's been in as a potential doping scandal. And
No, not even as a potential one. He's flat out said that every competition he's ever competed in has had somebody who's doped. Which I'm like, dude, you are how many Olympic gold medalists now? Like, you can't say that.
The most awarded swimmer in history.
Yeah,
so,
and so his take on this trans woman who's just trying to fucking swim really bothers me. And I've been sitting on this for about a week or so now, just kind of reading more into it. There's no good takes on this. I have not found a single good take. Have you?
Well, let's look a little bit. Maybe let's talk about the science for a second. Or I shouldn't even say the science. Let's talk about the policy for a second. So the NCAA requires that if you are going to be a trans person competing in your gender, you need to have been on suppression hormones for at least a year that has you at a level that is comparable or within range of other people of that gender. Now, unfortunately, that science is extremely not specific and not scientific enough to be able to clear the hurdle that they're trying to put for you, but that's the standard they're trying to put forth.
Well, it's also quite problematic because and I'm speaking on the trans level here, like, we don't have any control over what our bodies are doing. We can take steps to try and manipulate what they're doing, such as taking medical procedures or anything, but I'm sorry, anybody who identifies as a gender should be able to compete in sports for that gender.
Well, what if you were assigned female at birth and you show high levels of testosterone because you naturally show high levels of testosterone?
Exactly. No, the transphobes always point to athletes who look like they might be trans women and are actually just cis women with a lot of testosterone or a lot of secondary sex characteristics that align more with a masculine person. And so, like, science and sports science in particular, when it comes to gender, is really complicated. Crazy. It's almost like gender's complicated or something.
One thing I want to point back to is this has been a part of media conversation since the 1975, or even well before that. But I think people think about Renee Richards as an example of where the media frenzy behind this has become the problematic part more than anything else. I don't want things to happen behind closed doors, but I also think that media frenzy can cause this backlash to any productive conversation about how we can do this well in sports. So what this led to is the USTA tennis introducing the bar body test, which said that you would have to compete under a person's sex chromosomes. And that ended up meaning that Richards refused to take that test and was banned from doing the U.S. Open. That led to a New York Supreme Court case where they looked at the bar body test and decided that using that as the sole determinant of sex was grossly unfair and ruled that Richards was legally female, which means that she was able to compete in the 1977 U.S. Open.
Like, that's the biggest thing, and especially with, like, things that are going based off of sex chromosomes, is that nothing is as simple as X and Y, or XX, because chromosomes don't work like that. They are strings of DNA that are laid out into a way that is easier to read for people, but things happen to DNA all the time. Also, like, let's stop breaking people down into what chromosomes you have, because I am almost certain that nobody who's listening to this podcast has ever been tested for chromosomes, specifically in the X and Y categories. And if you have, please reach out, because I would love to hear your specific results.
We want to know, because as we've talked about, as we talk about the science of being trans, chromosomes are a continuum. They're not just the binary of those two letters. There's so much more that defines who we are as people. So when it comes back to sports, I mean, I'm thinking, Anna, you swam swim team.
I did.
You have participated in sports before. What needs to be done in order to make this work?
So my biggest issue with these news stories and things like Michael Phelps saying that it's not a fair playing field is that it is. Like, I'm sorry, but there's no reason to assume that a masculine person, regardless of their gender, is going to do any better than a female person or a feminine person. Like, are there characteristics of each sex that make them better at certain things over others? Potentially. I have very little evidence of that, but that doesn't mean that, like, women are completely useless in sports and men are the dominant. Like, that's the argument that transphobes have had forever against anti-trans legislation when it comes to sports is, oh, well, like, we're just gonna go and pretend that we're women and just dominate all these records. And, like, that's not how it works at all. The reason that Lia Thomas, in specific, is breaking all these records is because she's a really good fucking swimmer who's built like a swimmer. So from my take, like, just let people participate in whatever sports identifies with their gender, or just have co-ed sports and not have any gender distinction, because I don't think that it's necessarily important.
That would be the dream. I mean, it just makes me think, what I want to point to in this is where there's intersectionality in how people are being oppressed, and misogyny is the theme here. That, I mean, just think, women have not been able to compete in sports for a vast portion of our history. I think about how we treat athletes in general and the differences in how male athletes and female athletes are coached and the oppression and the misogyny that exists within these sports themselves. And I'm speaking out of turn because I am not a female athlete, and so I don't want to speak for anyone here. But if you're an outsider looking in, I think there's a pretty clear window into to how different even that experience is. So what if everybody was training at the same level with the same opportunity and the same kind of coaches being trained from the same age? What would that change about how people compete and at what level?
Overall, though, like, let's just stop gatekeeping anything.
Which is a great transition into
our main topic. So we have been pretty active on Instagram recently. If you didn't listen to last week's episode, I recently got back on social media, specifically Instagram, as a somewhat personal account. And the transgender account has also been fairly active. And we have received some feedback from the Instagram people, and by that I mean the trolls mostly, who have had interesting discussions and thoughts on pronouns and what pronouns people can use and things like that. It made me just say, why are we gatekeeping? Like anything? Because there's really no place for it in any of this discussion.
I think there are a couple of ways that I've seen gatekeeping. I mean, I've been managing our social media accounts for a little while now. I think the most interesting place that I see the worst of humanity is on Twitter, and I'm sure many of you can attest to what a cesspool that website.
Twitter is just a cesspool.
What it can be. And so the gatekeeping that occurs there is largely you should not be a trans person in this reality, let alone be an openly trans person on social media. And so I think that's the most blatant way that we've been able to look at that. So with my oversight of our account, I engaged in a conversation with someone who looked at a list of pronouns and neopronouns. And when we say neopronouns, we mean pronouns that are not he, him, she, her, or they, them. But there are many other ways that people can identify and do identify.
For example, my pronouns of they, fair.
And that was exactly the issue that I wanted to address, because someone on this post had said, not fey fair.
Yeah, which specifically they said not fey fair for anybody who wasn't Wiccan, which I find really interesting, because as a witch, an actively practicing transgender witch who uses fey fair pronouns, I'm not going to stop anybody from using fey fair pronouns or any sort of fey pronouns, because, well, the fey are important to specific witch, pagan, and Irish cultures. Nobody is going out and worshipping the Fae specifically to a point where it might become offensive to take on their name. Especially not the Fae, in which that is what they request us to call them, as opposed to their names, which in traditional media is fairy. So there's like a lot of dichotomy there, especially for me, a transgender witch, struggling with like, but why is this your take?
Looking for positivity within our community? Then listen to Queer We Are, the podcast where you hear some of the most interesting and successful LGBTQ+ people share uplifting stories, including their definition of success, how they achieved it, and what they learned along the way. Guests include celebrities, activists, politicians, athletes, and many more. Click the link in the show notes and check us out, or go to queerweare.com. If you've been looking for both fun and inspiration, now you know where to find us. Queer We Are.
Well, so I want to dig into why this is the take, and I'm going to do this without a lot of very clear research. I've done my best here in order to try to dig into this, but as I've had this conversation about specifically fey-fair pronouns and the background for that, read about some evidence that fey-fair pronouns being vilified came from a sect of anti-trans pagans who wanted to use that as an opportunity to say, if you're trans, you're not welcome in the pagan community, which for all of our experience with the pagan and Wiccan community is so far against the welcomingness of that community and the openness to ideas and sexuality and gender needs to be part of that conversation. And it's bizarre to me to see that not be the case.
If we are talking specifically about the term pagan, it is referring to any religion that came about or that is practiced during the time that the Abrahamic religions were coming about. That is the literal definition of the term. And so the fact that transphobic pagans are like, oh, well, we're not accepting of that is like, that goes against everything that even the term pagan means. And not to say that, if you practice witchcraft or anything, you are a pagan. For example, I don't necessarily identify as that, but it is still, the terminology and the phrasing is applicable.
Pagan tends to be used as the overarching term for any kind of witchy religion. So,
Yes,
Wiccan being the most common practice that people use. I don't want to digress too far into that, except for to say that, let's take paganism and Wiccan out of this. Let's say Fae Fair is an extremely cultural sensitive issue for people in Ireland. Let's just say that that's a reality, which from all evidence, I don't believe is the case. That there are people from Ireland who think that using Fae Fair pronouns is cultural appropriation of fairy worship. I mean, it's hard for me to even say. But the case has been made of where is that line of cultural appropriation when we're talking about how we self-identify. And
everything that anybody says where's the line, it's somewhere. There is a line somewhere. You're not going to be like, oh, well, I may identify as Fae Fair today, but tomorrow I'm going to identify as the one being, just the entire universe. I've never met a person who identifies as that, and if you do, I'd love to have a conversation with you. But, there's a line somewhere that is, I've never met a fairy worshiper. It's a struggle for me to say it's problematic in any way, because I accept people for whatever pronouns they want to use, even if those pronouns, in my eyes, might be problematic. And so, that's a conversation that needs to happen. And that's kind of my biggest point that I wanted to bring up in this topic is it's always a conversation. There's a line somewhere, and although that line might not be where you think it is, gatekeepers, there needs to be a conversation about that. So explain to me why you might use this pronoun or something. And it doesn't need to be a conversation of well, I'm not going to let you use this unless you defend yourself. No, in my view, it's, hey, I just want to know more. Can you explain to me why you feel this way? Why choose that pronoun over this one? And for me, just kind of talking about myself, I've never felt comfortable with they, them pronouns. Those are not my pronouns. And it could be as simple as that. But sometimes there might be something more, say you are Christian and your pronouns are God.
It sounds like there's some cognitive dissonance there if you decide to go that route.
Let's kind of talk about that a little bit more. Are your pronouns actually God, or do you feel like you're a God? And so there's a little bit of dichotomy there. And not to say that anybody's pronouns are invalid there. It's just something that I want to know more about and kind of understand where they're coming from.
Well, and so this is the answer to how do we handle gatekeeping, because gatekeeping can be either immediate invalidation of how someone identifies or the beginning of a conversation of, I feel like my culture is being appropriated, and so I would like to have a discussion about that, which is a far different approach than so many people in social media, because everything in social media is so binary and black and white and just two people screaming into the void until they get so tired of doing that they stop doing it. I have very few productive conversations on social media. And this particular conversation was me engaging with our account with two different people, one of whom gave up when I said, hey, of our duo, one of us is pagan, in response to her saying, you can't say anything about this unless you're pagan. And I was like, okay, well,
yeah, one of us is.
Here's the answer to that. But then the flip side of that was another person saying, no, cultural appropriation is absolutely the worst offense you can have, and the fact that you think that your identity is more important than protecting someone's cultural identity is essentially criminal. To which I'm the one who gave up on that, because I'm like, you know what? I actually don't have a very good response to that. And I think it's far more nuanced than that argument, and I don't have a way to express that.
And I don't necessarily disagree with that take either. There's some genuine, valid concerns and topics to discuss in there. But as I always say, it's always a conversation. Nothing just stops at an answer. There's no straight, pardon my language, queers, answers. Just there's so much that is nuanced here, and I understand where this person is coming from in that cultural appropriation really is not okay, but neither is stopping somebody from identifying as what they are.
I mean, if my pronouns were fuckery, how would we address that? And again, this is the challenging part about it, because what we want to do is validate people and create euphoric situations that help people feel better in their skin. And so if that is where someone is going, then I want to have a conversation with them of, is your identity meant to then be used for some kind of social commentary? Is it meant to be used for some kind of, which again, there's validation in that. Here I am, Cam, your dad here, wanting to parent a little bit and say, let's talk about how society is going to make that really hard on you as you move forward. And are you ready for what that is going to bring to your life? And again, not invalidating, but starting a conversation around how can we find euphoria in other ways maybe, or how can we make sure that at least you're going forward with a full understanding? And it's so hard for me to say this even with a straight face, because it's like, that is so much like, oh, you're just dadding the fuck out of me right now. And it's like, yes, I kind of am, because I want everybody to be successful and find euphoria. Like, that's my vision and dream and mission in this whole thing that we're doing here.
Playing off of that thought, I also don't want anybody who uses any of the pronouns that we've mentioned or anything like that to feel offended or like they need to defend themselves, because that's not at all my intention either. I don't want any trans person to ever have a conversation or defend themselves for something that they don't feel like they don't need to. Because in our podcast is a safe space for all identities, for all people. What I want to do is have a genuine conversation with anybody who's ready and identifies as that. Because it would help me understand and better be able to support those people. And not to say that they don't already have my full support, but I want to better understand those identities, because I don't share that identity. It's like how we have guest hosts on, and, AJ was able to talk a lot about non-binary topics, something that I know a little bit about because I am, but not nearly as much as they are who identify as non-binary. So,
and as usual, if there's something about what we've just said that you have an opinion on or can provide some guidance on, we just really want your feedback. So please shoot us a DM on social media, send a message to
questions@transgenderpod.com.
Thank you. And that helps us get a deeper understanding on these topics.
Honestly, and I don't ever want anybody to think that you or I, my dad, are ever experts in anything that we're talking about, because I've not done clinical research on any of the topics that we've discussed. I am simply going off of my own experiences and my own knowledge, which I hope is enough, but, I don't always get things right. And so I want to know from people who are also living these experiences.
So at this point in the episode, we like to talk about euphoria and the things that make us happy. And I just have a really brief one, and then I'd love to know if you have any euphoria this week. But, in our last episode, I talked about being pan-romantic without really a lot of understanding of what that meant for my identity, just sort of talking it through live with my daughter and, a number of listeners that hear our podcast. But I also made a point of putting a post up on social media, because I wanted to make sure that people who are in my circle heard it from me directly as opposed to indirectly through our podcast. And I just felt super euphoric in the fact that there was a ton of support from people and a lot of messages from folks and just sort of acknowledgement of like, hey, and a couple of people that are like, I tried to Google that and I have no idea what that means. And I'm like, hey, I'm happy to talk about that. Like, listen, I was
listen to our podcast.
Listen to our podcast and listen to me. Like, I don't really know what that means either. And I still don't feel comfortable calling myself part of the LGBTQA community, but it's that kind of support and the kind of welcomingness that this community just starting to talk about, like, hey, I would take any of you on a date because it does not matter who you are, because I have that kind of romantic attention that can transcend that. It feels extremely euphoric to me and felt so good to be able to say out loud to somebody who I know supports me wholeheartedly. And so I just want to say thank you to Anna, and thank you to all for all your support. And thank you to my wonderful friend who I had that initial conversation with, where I said, hey, here's a thing, and felt supported in that.
I will also just like to say on air, I am so goddamn proud of you, my father, in so many things. It's been almost a month since we've caught up, not on our podcast, and just so many things are going well, and I am so proud of you as a human and also as my dad. And so just congratulations, and I'm glad that you're feeling accepted and euphoric.
Thank you.
I have very often found my voice to be quite dysphoric, even after all the training that I've received. And I was going through training for my new job. I am working on the ambulance with Mayo. And as part of our training, we had to do a simulation lab where we went through calls in a controlled environment. So we get sort of a briefing, like what dispatch would give us, and then we go in with all of our equipment and kind of run the call like we normally would. And all of these were recorded so that we could go back and watch and make sure that, if we made a gross mistake or something like that, that we'd be able to catch it and talk about it. And I have to say, I did not find myself, my image, or my voice dysphoric in any of that, which is kind of a new bar for me. As much as I try and listen to our podcast, it can still sometimes be a bit of a pain for me. But, I just want everybody to know out there that, you can get used to your voice, even if it's not the voice that necessarily you'd want, ideally. But it's out there, and you can get used to it, and it's something that maybe you can accept in yourself eventually. P.S. I don't know if podcasts have postscript. My dad and I have been staring at each other this entire episode, and it's been really fucking awkward.
Making eye contact while we are talking about these topics. I am so glad we didn't talk about sex tonight, or else this would have been a much harder episode to record.
It was so hard to keep a straight face for some of the topics, just looking over and seeing you staring at my face.
It's just really nice to have you in my presence, though, so
yeah,
we'll
good to hang
that.
out again.
If you have questions about transitioning or supporting someone who's transitioning, and you'd like to talk about it on the show, please shoot an email to questions@transgendapod.com.
Be sure to check out our episode description for links to resources on today's topics.
And thanks for listening. I've been Cam.
I've been Anna.
And this has been The Transgenda.
Love you all, except the bigots. And Michael Phelps.
Would you like to support our podcast? Well, you're in luck. We have a Patreon now. Just visit patreon.com/transgendapod, and for as little as $3 a month, you can support the content that we're creating. And for $20 a month, you can join our Sticker Club, which provides you with a monthly live stream, a shout out on the podcast, and a sticker every month from ourselves and creators that we adore. Again, just visit patreon.com/transgendapod, and thank you for all your support.